for the Global Government Forum's Digital Leaders Research Report. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm really pleased to be steering us through the next hour of discussion and Q&A. In a moment, we'll hear from our two experts who will talk about the research and its key findings. But this is also an opportunity for all of you, the audience, to have some of your questions answered. So you'll hear from our speakers, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to get through as many of your questions as possible. So whichever device you're using, you should see at the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A function. Please do use that Q&A function to send in your questions at any point from now going forwards. I'm delighted today that we have with us Kevin Cunnington, who's the former Director General for the UK Government's Digital Service. Kevin has been integral in designing and carrying out this research, and in a moment he will talk us through the findings and give us his thoughts on some of those key findings. But first, before we hear from Kevin, I'd like to invite Matt Ross to say some words about the research itself. Matt is the contributing editor of Global Government Forum, and he worked with Kevin to produce this report. So without further ado, over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Siobhan. I just want to briefly describe what we did and why. I'll do so inside 5 minutes so we can get on to exploring a really strong and interesting set of findings and hearing Kevin's analysis. We start from the point that to serve their populations, governments are going to have to get to grips with digital and data technologies. The pandemic has created huge need for public services. And along with the financial crisis, it's drained the coffers. So governments do need to achieve better outcomes for smaller investments. And one of the key ways they can do that is by making full use of the potential of digital to, for example, cut delivery costs, improve policy making, target services, coordinate action across governments. There's many, many different ways in which these technologies can help. In all our work in research, editorial, events, we see that around the world, digital leaders trying to realise these opportunities hit a broadly similar set of obstacles, typically. And we wanted to research those barriers to understand their nature and how they vary in different national contexts, and to see how people got around them. And Kevin was the perfect guy to lead this research. He's obviously got a lot of experience in the private sector before joining government. And in government, he was both the UK's most senior digital leader as Director General of Government Digital Service, and then its digital envoy and Director General of the International Government Service. So he's had a really good overview of how the land lies around the world. So I'll just squeeze in a quick public thank you to Kevin for working with us on this. It's been a great project. First thing we did was look at the kind of existing research in the field. Kevin will talk more about this, but there is a number of league tables that rank governments by digital prowess or state of development. These can't take account of national cultures or systems or constitutions. What works brilliantly in one context can fail completely in another. So we wanted to produce research that would recognise the importance of these environmental factors so that digital leaders could look for ideas that would help them address their own unique, specific problems. Have the next slide, please, Alexa. Kevin then interviewed the digital leaders of 7 countries, all seen as quite well advanced on the digital agenda. He structured the questions using this 7 lenses of transformation technique, which the UK government uses to assess its own major projects. Essentially, we asked people to rate their own country's digital performance on each of these 7 metrics: vision, design, plan, transformation, leadership, collaboration, accountability, and people. You probably can't read the smaller text, but the full slide is available within the report for the detail of that. Interviewees were asked to score themselves on each of these topics and to talk through their kind of contexts and their experiences. Next slide, please. And these are the people we talked to, almost all of them the most senior digital leader in their country. Shahar Bracha, Acting Chief Exec Officer of Government ICT Authority of Israel. Jeff Huggins, who's Director of Digital at Scottish Government. Fariz Jafarov, Director of the eGov Development Centre of Azerbaijan. Paul James is Government Chief Digital Officer in New Zealand. Sim Sikut, Government Chief Information Officer and Deputy Secretary General of IT and Telecoms Estonia, who is about to leave the role, and Aaron Snow, Chief Executive Officer of Canadian Digital Service, who has just left the role, gone to a university in the US. Finally, Tan Eng Feng is Assistant Chief Exec for Services at GovTech Singapore. So a really heavyweight set of people, and the results were really fascinating. We found lots of common challenges and frustrations and some really inventive, effective ways to address them. The results are also very rich, showing not only who's doing what well, but also why and how they've managed to get it right. We broke the report down under 3 headings. That's creating and implementing a vision, investment and project funding, and leadership and capabilities. And beneath those headings, we have 7 key findings, which I will hand over to Kevin now to explain.
Thanks very much, Matt. So just before we go over to Kevin in terms of the findings, one, really good to hear why we did this. So, if you can get digital right, it can really improve outcomes to the citizen, drive out inefficiencies in particular as well. But actually, Kevin, before you go into those findings under the headings that Matt was talking about, as Matt mentioned, there's already kind of benchmarks out there. There's already attempts to set league tables across countries. So I just want your thoughts on why this particular piece of research is different and why you think this is so important.
Yeah, so thanks, Siobhan. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. So there were 3 motivations, having, as Matt pointed out, done the job. I mean, you can comment from the inside out, really. And the primary source of feedback you get as a country and a CDIO is through the benchmarks. And the benchmarks are undertaken by some very prestigious organisations, the UN, the OECD, the European Union, but they are all different. So you can appear at different points in the ranking at the same time, which is a little bit difficult to reconcile. They are in and of themselves opaque. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they ask you a set of questions, you respond to those questions, and they carry out their own analysis and ranking, and you have no real insight on that. So that can place you in a difficult position. When you're going up the tables, it's all fine and good. It's like being a football manager. When you're coming down, it's a bit more difficult to explain why that could be. And sometimes it might be valid, other times you just don't know. Matt mentioned this point, and we use this expression consistently throughout the report. Constitution, culture, politics, and legacy technology have a profound difference on where you start and how you can move forward. And the benchmarks take absolutely no account of that at all. They simply rank you on the basis of where they think you are. And then finally says there's a kind of private conversation between the CDIOs. We all think the benchmarking's become a bit of an arms race over time. Everybody wants to do well, nobody wants to do badly, generates a lot of commentary if you go down, it generates a lot of positive praise if you move up. So whilst they're useful, the main point about them is everybody's solution to the same problem is difficult. The report refers to no single consultancy solution. You can't roll out a single solution across the country. And recognizing that while our ambitions are the same, the benchmarks don't help people like me and my successors and my peers solve the issues because you just don't get the insight. So number one was, whilst they are useful, it comes with some caveats. And what we want to do was something that was useful. A second observation would be, there isn't that much co-working between the digital leaders across the world today. There are some exceptions, some notable exceptions, like the EU has worked together on policy, things like GDPR, and is now working on implementations of policy together. There are some examples led by Singapore out in Asia on what I would generally classify as border controls, import, export, to make life easier for Southeast Asian countries. But generally, there's an absence of digital global leaders getting together, trying to solve common problems in the same way where their constitution, culture, politics, and legacy all fit together. And then the final objective in this is to kind of remove Matt and I from being at the forefront of it and ask digital leaders themselves to create communities of practice where they co-work together, where they've got the same issue that they can address in the same way, and thereby help each other. Hopefully out of that comes more consistent global standards. So that's the three motivations.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. I think it's really nice to hear then, because I think that's so much about what Global Government Forum is about, is to help people collaborate more and share good practice. And if we can do research that kind of helps to facilitate that, then I think it will ultimately be very useful for the people who are in the audience today. So welcome their feedback on that as well in due course. So as Matt said, though, we had the research kind of sets out its findings under 3 key headings. So Kevin, over to you. In terms of the first heading of creating and implementing a vision, could you talk us through what the key findings were and your thoughts on those?
Yeah, so I guess people couldn't read the slides, but just for this first time, I'll read the first finding, which says, visions often depict a future picture of great digital services, but unless governments detail the levers, resources and reforms required to realise their goals, progress is typically slow. So what do we mean by this? Well, firstly, this was a real surprise section. So in almost every other analysis of a transformation programme I've done, vision is one of the key weaknesses. And vision is one of the key weaknesses because it's so hard to describe what you're trying to do. So if we all as an audience stop and just pause and think, could we describe one of our own government's key transformation programs, reform programs, in any area of policy you might want to think about, whether it's education, pensions, you name it? We, I think, would all struggle to figure out what a minister would say to us, and we'd all struggle to understand as the general public what those key priorities are. And when you then magnify that by, you've now got to get tens of thousands of civil servants on board to execute it, build it, and then to operate it, you realise if you don't get the vision right, quite often these big programs go wrong from that point onwards, really. And what we found in contrast here was it was exactly the opposite. And what we found that most digital visions were broadly the same. In fact, if I'm being honest, they were a little samey. You could almost say ahead of it, they would talk about user-centered services, joined up integrated services, operational efficiency, better tools for civil servants. And the risk of being provocative, and we're going to host a workshop on this with the CDIOs, you could almost pick up anybody's strategy, cut and paste it and give it to somebody else, because they were remarkably similar. And so unusually, whereas this is normally a key differentiator in terms of how well you do, this does not appear to be a key differentiator. And the purpose of the workshop is to find out really how to make all these strategies better. How would you convince the general public that you're doing the right thing, and ministers can talk about it in a sensible way. And there's a fantastic quote, in fact, I think it's my favorite quote in the whole report, where one of the CDIOs said, the strategy contained nothing objectionable, but also nothing actionable. And honestly, it certainly brings a smile to my face. I think it brings a smile to a whole set of my peers' faces. And what you realise is the best practice in this was all about how you created a design and a plan to implement the strategy, not about the strategy and vision itself. And the very best example we saw was a particular country that has a 3-year parliamentary period. And for every one of those years, the leaders in that organisation, in the centre and department, sit down together and co-create the list of achievables that they will get to at the end of that year, list of achievements. And then they measure it, which is reasonably unique. Most of the countries we talk to don't do that. But uniquely in this country, the CDIOs are bonused, they're compensated on their level of achievement against the master plan. And that seems to make, and again, we can get into this in a bit more detail, huge difference in being able to take a strategy that's rather samey and create material implementation progress in a way that others can't.
So really interesting on that first point then, there's no point having that strategy and vision if you don't actually look at some of the, which are going to be difficult things, is how you're going to implement that. There's no point having what looks like a perfect strategy if you don't kind of get out of that comfort zone. So it'd be interesting. Yeah, I mean, if people on the audience kind of that resonates with you, then please do send in your kind of comments or questions on that point. Thanks, Kevin. So on the next finding.
Yeah, seamless services. So we talked about all the visions being rather samey. All the government journeys have been rather samey as well. And that's not a great surprise at all, really, because we all set out 10 years ago trying to replace basic paper forms with digital front ends that were at that time still integrated with legacy services. And there's lots and lots of good reasons why that is a positive thing, which, you know, in the question and answers I can explain if we want to. And what's happened over time is that we've got more and more of those services, and they've become more complex, all of which is good progress. But with that is some bad news, because we've now not unwound the siloed experience of customer service that we created in the first place by having so many paper-based legacy services. And there's good news to this. The solution to this is obvious. We know how to fix it. The bad news is, for some countries, it's incredibly difficult to wind your way back out of that legacy. And the solution is fairly simple. You create a single digital identity for every citizen, and you use that to ensure that if you don't keep, you know, a single golden record of their data, then use that to make sure that their data is at least consistent across all the silos of government. And as it turns out, this is the great digital divide. This is crossing the Rubicon, the Rosetta Stone of digital. If you can create this digital identity, you can move forward and produce very joined up services very quickly, because you can link data sets together, people's tax records with other elements of their behavior. If you can't, you end up getting really quite stuck until you can. And that kind of brings us back to where we started, Siobhan, with constitution, culture, politics, and legacy. That there's a have and a have not element in this emerging that maybe we'll talk about in more detail in Q&A. Those people who've got digital identity are the people who had national identity in the first place, largely, which is actually quite a small number of people. And then the people who did not have national identity have been struggling to create a proxy digital identity for a whole variety of reasons. And again, we are, as GGF, going to run 2 workshops on this. It's worth stating 2, one for the haves who have national identity and one for the have-nots, because the solutions are totally different, and people are at different parts of the maturity matrix. The haves are now worrying about how they keep it secure and how they put it onto a mobile phone. The have-nots are still trying to figure out how we get to it in the first place and unwind the legacy.
Thanks, Kevin. I think it's really interesting, the issue about the digital IDs, because we've done various webinars with Global Government Forum over the past kind of months and years, and that issue always comes up. There's such different routes ahead for countries that do have those and countries that don't. And I think it's really interesting to understand the challenges of why some countries feel they're not going down that route. And so I do want to pick up on that on the Q&A. We'll come back to that one in the questions in a moment. But let's move on a bit, because I know we've got a lot to cover before we get onto the questions. So in terms of kind of the next set of findings, these are under the heading investment and funding. Do you just want to talk us through the key findings there?
Yeah, this was another surprise. We didn't ask about this at all. There's a great quote somewhere in the report that says, there's a lot of incentive to get the big blast funding first, then the people who want that money swoop in. And that's typically the way it works in government. You start off with an idea in a project. And again, this is one of the most common mistakes. The money comes in and then you've got to figure out how to do it. And you haven't thought through, you know, Matt described the 7 lenses, but you haven't thought through your accountability model. You haven't thought through your collaboration model. So it tends to start with a big bang and then kind of fizzles. Now, what we've seen here is with digital funding, and I'm paraphrasing to be provocative, there's this sense in many governments that we put a lot of money in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and actually our priority isn't digital anymore, it's climate change. You know, there's a sense from the treasuries around the world that things are changing and we've kind of done digital. But of course, that's not true at all. You never quite do digital. And the more of it you have, the more you need to continue to invest in it. So this was a big surprise. And I guess we'll talk about the next finding in a second, Siobhan, but our follow-up to both of these is to sit with the Chief Financial Officer of Government in summer and talk them through why is it that the kind of funding, and the next thing we'll talk about is procurement, why aren't they keeping up with the way the world is changing and accept that digital is going to continue to change the world as importantly over the next 10 years as it did over the past decade?
Yeah. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out. As you said, the priority now people feel is kind of net zero and climate change, but also with resources even tighter coming out of the pandemic, where people put those priorities, and do they understand, as Matt was saying, actually you can be more efficient if you get this right, but that's not necessarily how civil services around the world feel. Brilliant. So moving on to the kind of finding 4, I think we're on now.
Yeah, procurement hasn't kept up with agile. I mean, we always knew this. It has always been a problem. I guess procurement processes tend to rely on you writing large tender documents, going out to tender, doing analysis, are not part of the test and learn iterative cycle of agile. And we've always struggled with this. But what was surprising was how prevalent it still was. So in some countries, they have moved quite a long way forward to agile procurement, and others they really hadn't. So again, the follow-up with the CFOs is, what are we prepared to do about this? And I think maybe at this point also, Siobhan, there's a kind of sub-trend that weaves its way through the documents, which is where CDIOs have control, they feel they've done a good job. They feel they've made progress. Where they are dependent on others, and we'll see this certainly in the next section and in this section, they don't feel similar levels of progress have been made. And that's just because they simply don't have control. And I think part of the value add of Global Government Forum is we can have those conversations on a non-personal way with the chief financial officers and CEOs of government, and say, this is a sense that's coming out of it. How can we help? What should we? How could you do something about it?
Yeah, really interesting, as you say, because I think that leads us nicely onto the kind of final section and the final set of findings in terms of to what extent do digital leaders feel like they are truly integrated into that top level of decision making. So I think this is a particularly interesting chapter, I think, because it's all about kind of people and culture. And I think you found quite a lot of things here that surprised you. So could you talk us through these kind of last 3 findings under this set of headings?
Yeah, and by the way, I've said this many times, but transformation is all about people, not technology. And so it always comes back to culture. But finding 5 is good news. So there we go. 10 years ago, all of us would have said the most presenting problem in government was getting hold of good digital resource to implement services. Now, none of us think that is a problem at all. 5 years ago, it's still been a problem. Now it's not. So good news. I think as well, what people have begun to recognize is, whilst we can get hold of the resource, it's still a competitive market. You have to provide careers for people. You have to provide the training. And we called out the UK actually in the report as the best example, where the UK had worked actually fairly extensively with their 17,000 digital data and technology staff to create a framework that they could all fit into, could all see careers as part of that, and could all see a way of being compensated at an equitable level for that. So finding 5 was all good news, actually.
Yeah. Great. And then, so going on though, I think there are definitely issues around kind of recruitment and retention. I think this is a particularly kind of challenging issue, I think, for the public sector when it comes to leaders.
Yeah, different story entirely at the top.
Yeah.
And again, if I may just quote one of my colleagues, we pay very competitively for junior staff and competitively enough to get a fair number of mid-level staff, but we're absolutely not competitive when it comes to the most senior staff with the people we need most. And that's quite a big statement, really. I think others also noted that there's no substitute for having good staff. So where we've used interims, that hasn't been successful because they don't have the mandate, maybe the longevity. Where we've tried to over-promote people, again, most people feel that's put them in a difficult position of trying to run some very large programs without the experience. And candidly, the mistakes you make outweigh the benefits of saving money on salary. I think what we also saw was the problem was particularly acute in countries with strong domestic technology industries and sectors, because there's an easy opportunity for people working in the private sector.
Yeah.
And particularly in conjunction with countries where civil service pay is kind of linked to the pay of their political leaders. You know, the old adage, we shouldn't pay somebody more than we pay the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So it was particularly acute. And as GGF, Global Government Forum, we carried out a survey recently with the top non-digital civil servants, all of whom think we've got this wrong. We all think we should be paying more. And the bottom line, candidly, is not paying to get good enough people. It's a really false economy. It costs way more in the mistakes we made on some of these big programs than we ever save in, you know, curtailing salary by that amount of money. So that was pretty strong, actually, from all CDIOs.
I'm going to come back to you on that one when we come to questions, because when I was in the civil service, it's been years since I was in the civil service, this was still an issue about how you kind of, you know, recruit yourself. I think it's something that we haven't yet cracked yet. So what was, before we do get on to questions, and just to say to the audience, thank you. I can see you're already sending in your questions, so thank you so much. Can I just put a plea? Could you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, please, just so we can keep all of the questions in one place? That would be great, thank you. If you put something in the chat, if you want to send it over to the Q&A, so type it out again in the Q&A, that would be really helpful, thank you. So Kevin, what was the final finding before we move on to our Q&A session?
So the final finding was quite strong, actually. And I will get around to using one of the quotes, Siobhan, but it was to say that people felt that the very top, and we put digital leaders and ministers, but it's really more about departmental leaders, the ministers in truth. Often lack the understanding commitment to drive digital transformation. So let's unpack that if we may. So we start with the positive. Absolutely every CDIO said their PermSec or equivalent absolutely owned the problem. This wasn't about ownership, it was about something else. So if we now kind of walk a mile in the shoes of the CDIOs, why were they so vocal? And the answer is transformation's hard. I mean, that's why we don't get around to doing it. And it's hard because at some point or at multiple points in that process, there are some conflicts that benefit some stakeholders and other stakeholders, you know, maybe don't benefit at all or benefit in the much longer term. So, and CDIOs simply don't have the authority or maybe the longevity in that department, in that organization to resolve them. So if your CEO, PermSec, won't drive it, you either get stuck or in my opinion, worse still, you compromise. So part of the reason why they're saying this so vocally is because it puts them in a very difficult position. So what is it we heard? What's the problem? And again, we're meeting the CEOs and PermSecs later next week to talk about it. But what we heard was a couple of things, and this word I'd like to use one of the quotes, which is it's strong stuff, really. The quote is, the senior leaders have spent their entire careers being reflexively liability conscious and risk averse, because that is how they got to be, quotes, departmental leaders. And we are now asking them to do the unthinkable and embrace change. It's the wrong cohort to lead such an operation. And you can see why some people might say that. The other thing we heard was about risk and reward. So in the modern technological landscape, it is often the case that the centre, for instance, might build a set of services that a department comes to rely on. And accounting officers, permanent secretaries are quite uncomfortable with that delegated authority beyond their control. So there's a couple of things we heard. There are a few things personally that I think I'll throw into the mix when we talk to the CEOs next week. And that is, there's something about they haven't had the time or generated the time to learn what a transformational skill set is. There's something about time poverty. There's also something about making the time in the job. And I can see why that's incredibly hard, having been on the inside of this, but you do have to make the time to drive it yourself. And personally, I think there's something about the way we set up and describe the roles. So for me, I've always been struck by the fact that we call our most senior people permanent secretaries. Permanent for me implies continuity, not change. In other parts of the world, I know we've got a lot of people on from Canada today. Permanent secretaries are described as deputy ministers, and I think that's better. It kind of joins a few of the dots for me. And in other countries, of course, they're just called chief executives. So the answer is, we don't know what's behind it. We know it's a problem because we're hearing it loud and clear. And part of, I think, our value add is to have this conversation with CEOs and firm sex next week and say, well, we're hearing this pretty loud and clear. Were you aware of this? Why do you think that could be?
So really interesting. What it's shown is the research has kind of shone a light on some of these really tricky challenges. So even there, just in that last set of findings, all about kind of people, you know, you mentioned there the challenges around time restraints, around resources, around culture and language even, all playing their part. And we don't necessarily have the answers to those from this research, but it's about starting that conversation, and we can bring the right people together, hopefully, to start thinking about some of the solutions. So thank you so much, Matt and Kevin. That was kind of a run through of the key findings. We've got lots of questions coming in from the audience, which is great there. I just want to pick up on two things, Kevin, before we go over to the audience questions, because I think they really stood out for me. So one was this idea of some countries having a digital ID and some not, because I think that's such a fundamental difference. So I just want your thoughts on what do you think is going to happen, like in terms of that divergence? What do you think is going to happen in particular for the countries that aren't yet going down the route of digital IDs, and what problems do you think that's going to cause?
That sounds like a fairly straightforward question, doesn't it? And at one level, I can make it straightforward, but it would be quite wrong, because the trouble with identity, the reason for trying to create it is it's so difficult. But if you look today, maybe I give you a couple of experiences from my personal experience. We can already see the difference between those that have it and those that don't. So this week I used a UK-based service. I won't say what it is, because whenever I do that, they bring me up immediately afterwards and say, why did you pick on me? So I won't say who it is. But the first, I put in my reference and I got asked, how much would I like to pay? I thought, this is a funny question. And then when you look it up on gov.uk, there's an amount you should pay. But if you're on low income, you can pay a lesser amount. But the point is, you know, that system, if it had been integrated with my tax account, could have told me that already. So part of it is you don't realise, but we're not getting the best experience today, just intra-government, if we've not joined up the data sets. And, you know, the service could be so much more smooth if we did. The second example is kind of where we failed in the UK to establish the relationship between private and public sector. So pretty much every CDIO we talked to said their most successful transformation was taxation. Everybody feels we've all made huge strides in going from paper to digital. And personally, I would completely support that. In the UK, I think HMRC has done a fantastic job in moving to where we are today. The system's so much easier to use. But then you look slightly over the fence towards Denmark. And in the UK, I do, and I think most people still do, have to fill in a tax return. In Denmark, it's absolutely the other way around. Denmark write to you and say, we've calculated your tax. This is what it is. If you disagree, please write to us. And you realise, even when you've got intra-government right, first example, there's still integration with potentially the private sector that make the customer experience so much better. So one is, I think there is already a difference. What I expect the have-nots to do is really go back to basics, honestly, and just establish a credential, a login that allows you to at least log in with the same username and password. And over time, government will figure out a way of making sure that that's, you know, a credible way of asserting that you are who you say you are. When you want to claim a tax refund or whatever, some of the trickier stuff. So I think the haves will move on, and already are doing. The have-nots will have to probably go back to basics, start again, and work their way forward. But again, that's specifically why we were in the workshops with the have and the have-nots, just to understand where they're thinking ahead.
Well, it's interesting, Kevin, because I think the questions coming in already. So before I go on to my second question, I've noticed we've got two already on this issue of kind of digital IDs, digital identity. One's from Susan Fleming, who says, I'm not sure there is public support for the concept of a single digital identity due to a mistrust of government departments and what they might do with this information. And she points to kind of a mistrust of vaccine passports, for example, in the UK, as an example of that. And Jim Downey similarly has asked about kind of security and trust issues. So on the digital identity front, has anything new been discovered on the security front, i.e. safeguarding citizen data, given that this is key when joining up kind of public sector data in particular? So is it this issue around trust, do you think, that's the problem? And it feels to us in the UK, we're used to this conversation around digital ID and a mistrust of digital ID, but it's so very different from countries that have digital IDs. They don't seem to have those trust issues. So is that a big part of the problem?
I think it's back to the country, Siobhan. So if you'd asked me this question, let's say 5 years ago, I would absolutely agree with the first question, which is because we had the National Identity Card Scheme in the UK, which didn't obviously work, there was a genuine worry about privacy. But I would say over the last 5 years, it's moved on from privacy, and Jim's right on this, it's moved on to security. And maybe, I think what people probably who are not in the space don't realise is the potential for criminal activities based on a digital identity are so much greater than they were in the real world. So if you're in the real world and you're committing crime, you're generally limited by the amount of crime you can do in one day.
Right.
But with digital, you can be in 100 different places in one day. So digital identity has to be so much more secure than physical identity for that reason. And that's one of the reasons why it makes it quite complicated. But I mean, you could literally, and he says there's someone who's had to appear in front of a public accounts committee to explain the country's digital identity policy, spend days and years on this, and only at that level get to expert levels. It's a very complicated set of services and a very difficult thing to break down if you don't have national identity in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, my second question, picking up on what you talked about in that final set of kind of findings around how difficult it is sometimes to get kind of senior professionals, digital professionals into the civil service. And as I said, this is an issue I think that the civil service have struggled with for many years. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on kind of what are some of the solutions then to attracting, retaining, recruiting and retaining the very best people. And surely the solution can't just be, because we don't have the money in the public sector, to pay more and more. So what are some of the solutions?
Well, in some countries, the answer is exactly that. That's probably the point that's worth making. That and some of the countries we spoke to, they do pay market rates. So it's not that it can't be done. It's back to this constitution and culture and politics. So, but equally, you counterbalance that with there are a good many people in this country who think public service is more important to them than earning a few quid, candidly. So there's a little bit of balance. But I think, as we said earlier, there's no single solution to this. Every country will have to find their own way. I think the ones that stood out were the countries that had this dual problem of competitive tech industry, making it very attractive to work in the private sector, coupled with too low public service pay, not enough flexibility. And I think we'll just have to continue to work that through. I think the UK would say at this point, it probably hasn't got the answer quite right. There's still a need to have that conversation.
Thanks, Kevin. Here's a question which is probably for you, Kevin, but also maybe Matt might want to come on this, because I think it's about the research itself. It's from Timothy Hatton, and it says, was any effort made to reach out to junior staff or the people who have to implement and use digital services? Did you find any communication gaps between them and their senior leaders?
The answer is we didn't talk to that point at all, Siobhan. So because of the nature of doing this virtually, we carried out quite an abridged consultation with the senior leaders anyway. Now, normally, when we've done this in the past, we've had a whole group of people in a room and workshopped it for a day. In this specific kind of pilot, we spoke to the CDIOs for an hour, so there just wasn't the opportunity really to get grassroots feedback. But of course, in an ideal world where we can all travel and workshop again, that is something we'd want to be doing. Yeah.
Matt, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just I need to say that, I mean, the nature of this particular piece of research was to compare the experiences of national digital leaders and to try to provide something aimed very much at that particular audience. But we do all kinds of work. We do totally recognise the the immense expertise that exists within the frontline staff and the workforce. I mean, we do a lot of online surveys where we will gather information from across the workforce. We've just run the Civil Service Data Challenge, which was all about tapping into the ideas and expertise of, frontline staff. One of the finalists in there was, works in a Job Centre Plus in a very junior role, and his idea went right up to the final, and that was about pulling ideas out from that group and getting them in front of the senior leaders towards implementation. So I think it's a fair question, because they're absolutely right. We could, of course, have learned much more had we had that facet within this research, but it's something we believe in, but this wasn't the nature of this piece.
Yeah, thanks. It's great. We've got so many questions coming in. Here's one from Kevin O'Sullivan. I'm not sure you are able to answer this, because as I understand it, this was kind of Chatham House rules, wasn't it, the research? But Kevin has asked, is it possible to name a country as having the best model? So which kind of country or countries would you see as having the best model of digital development? And he says, Kevin, you mentioned a nation that had a 3-year parliamentary term and officials compensated according to their achievables in that term. Do you think this is a good way of incentivizing civil servants to deliver on a vision?
You're absolutely right, Siobhan. What we agreed with all the respondents was that we would only quote them where they agreed to be quoted, in the report itself. That's why we used a number of quotes in the 3 examples. And the second part of the question was around the 3-year plan and the compensation. Personally, I do, but it depends on your culture, Kevin, honestly. I mean, what we saw, and I think we did quote Israel and their entrepreneurial culture. And it just depends on your constitution, your culture again. But personally, having come from the private sector more than the public sector, I do believe there's an opportunity to bring in more public sector-like incentivization into government to get better services. I mean, that's just a personal view, but that's where I would be.
Thanks. And Matt, I think I'm assuming on Global Government Forum's website in general, there are examples of good practice where you've interviewed people, or we've done other webinars on this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole load of webinars, and we learn a lot from interviews as well. And I think, Kevin's response is absolutely right there. It really isn't about, as he said initially, finding, the perfect country that's doing everything right and saying everyone else do it like this. It's just not going to work. I mean, as Kevin said, in Israel, there's this entrepreneurial culture. There's a kind of, do, don't ask. And is deeply rooted in Israeli culture. I think similarly, we can see the same in Estonia, where there's quite a sort of, it's a very small country. They know each other within the government. They're very collaborative. It's kind of a startup culture. They are willing to try things without knowing what it's going to end up with. And happy to sort of start and develop things incrementally along the way. That is enormously effective for Estonia. Meanwhile, in Singapore, utterly different. They see the value of innovation, collaboration, but they introduce very smart top-down systems that essentially require it. You will use this piece of shared component, you will collaborate, you will share data. So there they put it all through the system. It gets both Estonia and Singapore are brilliant, and Israel too on digital. But because they have chosen methods which are appropriate to their own culture and system. Yeah.
Well, that kind of is a nice way in, I think. I'm going to link 2 questions that have come in here. One from Simon Harrington and one from Gary Gelling, because they're both about that kind of culture and leadership. So going back to a lot of the things you said, Kevin, at the end there in your run through the findings. So is there a way to mature leadership from the liability conscious, risk averse mentality of many of our senior people to a balanced risk management approach? So as you were saying, Matt, there's some of the best examples of this where people are prepared to try things. And then Simon says that kind of digital leaders in the UK government tend to be kind of senior administrators with no real digital experience, and department heads don't know much about the issues, and that can cause damage to progress. So Kevin, I guess this is unpicking again a bit more those issues you were saying about leadership and culture, but did you want to respond to Gary and Simon on those 2?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond, although I think reasonably I defer and ask the CEOs of the firm sector themselves how they feel about it. But my sense is you can't really blame a permanent secretary if you've trained them for 20 years in being a permanent secretary that they're not now transformational, because that wasn't the job they were trained for. So at one level, almost 20 years too late to have this conversation. We should have had it 20 years ago. But at another level, for sure, there are programs, at least in the UK, like the Major Projects Leadership Academy, that although they're time intensive, people do go on and people do learn. There's a different way of doing things and driving things. So it's not, it's not irrecoverable. It can be recovered. I think when we get to this, we'll find the CEOs will say some of it is about how they perceive their role. Some of it is about how they've been trained in the first place. Some of it is about time poverty, in being able to, refocus a lot of their energies on driving things. But I think, I am speculating, obviously.
Yeah.
And it'd be better to wait a week or so, and maybe we do something like this again.
Yeah.
And talk about what we learned from the Global Government Summit, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, actually, we've got another question. So I think the Global Government Summit is one of the answers actually to this question. But Jim again has said that you mentioned, Kevin, there's not much co-working across countries in this area. Is there a genuine appetite for more of that, do you think? And how might it be encouraged? And I guess things like the summit are one way of doing that. But do you see others in terms of getting kind of more sharing of good practice and co-working across countries?
Yeah, so I was absolutely guilty of not spending enough time with my peers internationally. Yeah. And I've always regretted it, but it was time poverty. And I think all my peers regret that as well, because you have a conversation with someone who's tackling exactly the same problem as you, sometimes in the same way with the same constraint. You think, well, not only is that actually quite therapeutic, but actually I can see a way forward now in a way that I wouldn't have seen before. So I think, part of what we're trying to do as GGF is provide real value by getting people together to have those conversations. And the feedback we get, by the way, from these summits is fantastic. Oh, I wish I'd done this years ago. I'm so happy you've done this for us. But just give people more value so that they recognise and therefore they make the opportunity to do these things in a way that, I've been guilty of not doing myself.
Yeah.
Just add on that actually I was really pleased with people's enthusiasm for participating in the project. So just as a really straightforward metric, yes, digital leaders are really quite keen to sort of share what they've learned and to learn from others.
Yeah, thanks. We've got a couple of questions coming in around kind of digital and inequality. So there was one from Khadija El Houdi, who says that I know progress doesn't wait, but isn't digital transformation deepening inequalities between countries, Khadija has said, but I think there's also this concern actually digital can create inequalities within a kind of population, people that are kind of left behind. So that's one issue. And then we've just had a question in from Carlos Santizo saying, one of the growing concerns about digital acceleration is the politics and geopolitics of tech, in particular, making sure that new technologies work for, not against democracy. What can be done about it, and what are digital leaders' views on this in terms of this report? So what are the risks for government, and how do we kind of address those and get that right? And sort of bringing in all things like the use of AI and those kind of things. So Kevin and Matt, I mean, I don't think you specifically covered those issues in this report, but any thoughts on kind of risks about digital and technology and inequalities and how they might be addressed going forward?
I'd say in one way digital can be a great equalizer. I mean,
you've frozen at least me, Siobhan, but I can hear you.
Can you hear me now, Kevin?
I can hear you, Siobhan. Am I audible?
I can always hear you. It just seemed to have frozen for me.
Oh, sorry. Is it better now?
Kevin's now frozen. Can you hear me, Siobhan?
I can hear you, Matt. Yeah.
I'll just briefly answer whilst Kevin returns.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think actually digital technologies can be an equalizer. We had Azerbaijan and Estonia, which are kind of probably middle income countries, and both of them actually are doing,
Mm,
is helping them come forward. I'd also say that, well-designed digital services should be more accessible, and require less kind of effort and hard work to access than traditional public services. The other point was around, there's a wider point around how kind of the private sector is using digital technologies. That was certainly outside our remit. There are obviously issues around how states use technologies and data. And I think there, again, there's all of the countries we spoke to were democracies. There's quite a wide range in how people approach it. Again, to pick on Estonia and Singapore, in Singapore, people are really quite comfortable with quite a high level of government knowledge about them. They have a very high level of trust in government. And so, yeah, they're content for government to share data like this. In Estonia, they actually put the power in the hands of the individual, who can see within their own, digital ID dashboard or whatever, exactly how information about them is being used, and then that gives them the confidence to say, yes, you may use the data like that. So there's certainly ways to address people's concerns.
Kevin, can you hear me better now? Thanks. So as Matt said, the questions there were about kind of the risks of digital transformation deepening inequalities, whether that's kind of between countries or whether it's within a population. And also, how can we make sure that kind of governments and the private sector, as Matt said, use technologies to further democracy, not to work against it. So your thoughts on those kind of issues?
Well, I was lucky enough to catch Matt's answer, Siobhan. So I'd entirely agree with Matt, but there is another side to this. So Carlos, and I can't remember the question. All right. One of the challenges we had in the UK, very specifically, in creating digital identity was not everybody has a passport, a driving license, and a bank account. So you do find there are people who are less able to participate than others. So there is a sense of inequality and bring that forward. One of the things Matt and I have been postulating is where to go next with this. And I guess, oh, that's my doorbell and the dogs. I'm very invaded by dogs.
The dogs are very happy with whatever's being delivered.
Thinking about is, we did talk to 7 of the arguably most advanced countries. Wouldn't it be nice to talk to countries that were perhaps one step behind, perhaps on a regional basis? So let's say you went to North Africa. Would you find the same kind of trends? Would you find the same maturity? Would you find the same issues? And I think that would be an evolution for us. And Carlos probably has the same point around South America. What would happen if you did this in South America? Would you get a different sense or not? And the answer is we don't know, but I'd like to try it and just understand whether this is, local to advanced democracies or whether there are completely different issues we should be considering as well as we go forward.
Thanks, Kevin. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. So I think we've probably only got time to just get in one more quick question. And actually, it was the first question, I think, that came through on here. But I just wanted to leave it to the end because I think Martin's question was, is the lack of vision due to the consultants that were almost certainly involved in advising governments? I want to broaden that a little bit because I think one of the things you said is there wasn't really a lack of vision. There was more a kind of an issue around how you implement visions. But I guess this is more a question around, do you think civil services around the world rely too much on kind of that external kind of expertise at the moment? And is that again about this balance between growing your own and bringing in kind of experts from outside? So Kevin, your thoughts on this kind of issue?
We heard examples of both, to be honest. So certainly, if I go back to my specific case, we did write it ourselves. I didn't rely on consultants. I think you're right, Siobhan. It's not the lack of vision, it's the sameness of the vision, honestly, not the lack of. But in other countries, we did hear that people felt quite dependent on, other people helping them by bringing in consultants. So again, like all of these things, it's a pretty mixed picture, even across the 7 people we spoke to.
Yeah, thanks.
Just on that point, the problem with having it may be that they look at these strategies look a bit similar because there's a kind of a standard set of consultants' answers. I don't know. There's certainly a consultant might be able to write a strategy like that, but they can't own it because they're not there in the organisation, and then they'll do the job and leave. Actually, obviously, as Kevin was saying earlier, the strategy is only as useful as its implementation, and this is where a consultant is going to struggle on that particular issue.
Thanks, Matt. So we've still got a few questions, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer every single one of them. I think most people who sent in a question have at least had one of their questions answered. But it does show there's a real, I think, hunger out there, Kevin, for people to know more and people to delve into this a bit further. So could you just I know you've mentioned various kind of events throughout your presentations, but what are kind of the next steps and where can people get more kind of support or more advice or follow this up over the next kind of weeks and months?
Yeah, so I think, well, just to reiterate kind of what we learned on the journey, really, Siobhan, we did speak to 7 of the more arguably advanced nations, but I guess, and their self-assessments were really quite high on average about their level of maturity. But what I was particularly struck by was, we're not at the start of the beginning almost.
Yeah.
The sense that we're even a third of the way through, halfway through, is nonsensical. There's a huge journey ahead of us. And even some of the most mature countries have so much more to do on issues like, digital identity and creating single records of citizens.
Yeah.
And then you think about where the tail of this would be. There's an awful lot that those people could give back to people who are today operate in a less digital world. So we've taken most of the topics that we didn't have an answer to, if you like. We just understood the sentiment and said we'll follow up. The intent is to try and co-host with one of the countries that have either cracked it or haven't cracked it, and create more of a community. And specifically, I think on the technology side, we've committed to holding a workshop on vision, just to see what is the best one. What would it look like? How would you improve it? How would you make sure that the public could understand it perhaps a little bit better? 2 is we've committed to having these 2 separate digital identity workshops because we recognise they're totally different. 3rd is we are speaking to the PermSex next week about the issues around leadership and probably also digital leaders pay, to be honest, if I could squeeze it in. And then we are meeting with all the CFOs in Tallinn in summer and focusing on funding and procurement. And really, beyond all that, what people like Matt and I and GGF are trying to achieve is just get some of the CDOs to co-own some of this and begin to drive it forward in their own kind of way with the people whose constitution, community and politics most align with them on the specific issue they're trying to deal with.
Thank you. So loads going on. As you say, it all comes down to people. It's really good to see Global Government Forum kind of trying to create these communities where people can all work with each other across different countries. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I just want to say a huge thanks to all the audience for sending in so many great questions. Thank you for being so engaged. To Matt, thank you so much. And to Kevin, thank you so much for sharing so much of your time and expertise with us. Don't worry if you were on the audience today, you will get a link where you can watch all of this again, and that will be sent round to you, but also setting out all of those events that are coming up going forward. So you will be able to kind of register for those if you are interested. And also, please, if you haven't yet read the research and read the report, please do, because obviously we could only go into a certain amount of detail today, but it's really worth kind of reading that report and looking at all of the detail that is in there. But from me, wherever you are around the world, a huge thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a really good afternoon, evening, or the rest of your morning. And I hope we see you at another Global Government Forum event very soon. Thank you and goodbye, everybody. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.